grew to love horror through my parents, my mom, actually, specifically. My late mother, Patricia Stevens Due, was a civil rights activist. And while she was a very serious person, she had a great, great love for horror movies. I think because she had been a civil rights activist. So my first memories was growing up with these reruns, creature features of the old Universal horror classics like The Wolfman. And, for a time, integrating a neighborhood that had never had a Black family living there, I was first exposed to this idea of hostility, this idea that you don't know which neighbors like you and which neighbors don't. A 5-year-old kid might randomly call you the N-word or a teenager. So that was very frightening. And I know there were things my mother and father were keeping from us, like death threats and even more serious things. So I think on an unconscious level, I did not feel entirely safe. So yes, as a civil rights lawyer, my father would hear from the FBI, oh, be careful about opening mail. There's someone bombing civil rights lawyers and judges. It's like, oh, okay. So that's Tuesday. And my parents had been through worse, in the 60s, where they literally felt their lives were at risk in a very real and visceral way. So I think that is why my mother gravitated to horror. I think it's that sense of unease, that sense of maybe perhaps being surrounded by people who smile at you to your face, but might, throw rocks at your house at night, helped sort of plow the field for me to be a horror fan.
So on top of many accolades that you've gone through with your career, one of the things that you do is you are a professor at UCLA. And the class and the course that you teach is on Black horror and Afrofuturism. Kind of describe what exactly that course is like, kind of what are the stuff that you teach.
So I'm really lucky. I teach courses at UCLA that I love and would just take myself as a student, one in Black horror and one in Afrofuturism, which is basically Black science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and includes more music videos and things like that. So in the Black horror class, it really was Jordan Peele's Get Out that helped my department chair see, oh, right, this would be a great course. You use that as kind of a linchpin and then go through this whole history of horror. So in my Black horror class, really, I began with a film from 1940 called Son of Ngagi, and the screenwriter was Spencer Williams, who was later best known for Amos and Andy and that kind of thing, which was basically all a lot of Black performers could do in that time. But he took it a step farther and decided he was going to make movies and help create these movies. So he created this horror movie called Son of Ngagi, which is super, super corny in some ways, but it's also really groundbreaking just because it has this Black cast, a Black lawyer, a Black doctor, a Black police detective. But then there's some horror from the Blaxploitation era, Blackula, Ganja and Hess, even though that isn't Blaxploitation, but a different kind of vampire take using the prism of the connection to Africa and Blackness and addiction. And then, Eve's Bayou, the 90s was just a golden time for all kinds of Black art. And that's when you started to see a lot of horror movies popping up. Death by Temptation led off in 1990. Eve's Bayou came out in there. Tales from the Hood, which is one that a lot of people might have seen. It's kind of a cult classic. So there were a lot of Black creators trying to get their movies made, and miraculously, sometimes they did get their movies made. But really, I would say it was after Get Out in 2017 that kind of knocked the doors open. So you start to see a whole lot of different kinds of Black horror. Not just racism as the monster, which Get Out was, but like Jordan Peele's later work. It can be about class differences. It can be about what it feels like metaphorically when Hollywood is trying to eat you, which is my take on Nope. So there are so many different kinds of stories that Black horror creators can tell, some of them about race, but also I think what makes horror novel is that fans of horror just want to be scared.
With that class, you kind of went through some of the movies. One that I also kind of wanted to bring up, as it's actually one of the movies that we are going to be showing during the night, is obviously the original Night of the Living Dead.
There are some horror fans who will argue, well, George A. Romero wasn't Black, so that can't be Black horror. But as a Black horror fan, we are definitely claiming it. We are inviting Night of the Living Dead to the cookout, as they say, because Romero really took a chance in 1968, casting a Black lead, Dwayne Jones, who was also in Ganja and Hess, by the way. So he's in two pretty classic black horror movies or horror period, movies from that era. And Romero always said that Dwayne Jones was the best actor. He put in the best audition and he didn't intentionally cast black. And I have no choice but to believe that story because everyone I talked to who ever knew George Romero echoes that. And the actor who was the black lead in Dawn of the Dead also told the same story. Having that black lead is also a huge social statement about the rise of black leadership and black humanity and remaking black heroes in a way that Hollywood wasn't used to. But the other side of that is if you have racial issues, having Dwayne Jones as a lead just makes it even scarier. So you can kind of have it both ways. Black audiences are like, yay, we get to be the hero. But racist audiences are like, oh my gosh, he's the hero now, I'm really scared. So you really get everything out of that casting decision.
With Jordan Peele, as you mentioned, you've mentioned a couple times, you obviously have gotten the chance to work with him. I know he's in horror noir, but he is also, you also wrote an episode of The Twilight Zone for the second season. I believe the episode is called Small Town.
Yes, A Small Town.
And kind of what was that experience like, getting to work with kind of the director that a lot of people will cite as bringing about like a new sort of appreciation for not only black horror, but just horror in general. And then also getting to kind of work on a show as iconic as The Twilight Zone.
I know, and that was my very first television credit was The Twilight Zone. So I'm super pleased about that. So any good Twitter user knows that when someone follows you and you follow them, now you can instant message back and forth. And I've reached the point where I've overcome my shyness. I was like, hey, it would be great if Jordan Peele could come to my class. I don't know if they've had 50 other notes like that day, but instead of silence or a polite, refusal, instead 2 hours later, I get a DM from Jordan Peele's account saying I could surprise them. That would be funny. Ha. And I've been like that ever since. So he came to my class. I was like that the whole time. I mean, really, honestly, I've just been like that the whole time because I'm such a fan. And then we went to pitch at Monkey Paw. You don't make a connection like that if you're a screenwriter and leave that undone. So heck yeah, we went in there. We pitched a lot of short stories. I had my eye on Lovecraft Country, but that had already been staffed. And you can just tell when someone wants to find a way to work with you. It's very different than when you're fighting for someone to work with you, when they are like, where can we put you? How can we do this? So we pitched for season 1 and it didn't happen. We didn't take it personally. That's how it works out. But season 2, we heard back, Jordan feels really bad. Let's talk some more for season 2, and settled on an idea that everybody liked, and boom, I had my first credit, co-wrote it with my husband Stephen Barnes, who by the way also wrote for The Twilight Zone in the 80s. So that was a full circle moment for my husband.
You've written many books, and you have, some of them are horror related, others are not, but just kind of when it comes to writing, what's kind of your mindset going into any new works? Kind of what's your process? And then like when it comes to writers in general, kind of what's your advice to them when it comes to writing? And it could be advice for writing horror or just writing in general.
My stories come to me as horror premises mostly. Almost 90% of what I write is horror. It's the way I think. There was a time in the 90s when I started, I wish that were not the case. It was sometimes a harder sell, but it's just the way I work out my internal fears and kind of work myself up for whatever obstacles are lying in my path. So whether it's aging parents or a death in the family or illness or uncertainty, which is an artist's life, trust me, I find a way to sort of hone in on one question I want to answer or one situation I want to see resolved, and the story grows out of that. And I get real joy out of watching my characters rise to the occasion. That's the whole point, right? In Night of the Living Dead, Barbara trips and falls, and my students are like, oh, she's useless. And that was sort of the old school model. But there are other kinds of women in that movie who do not trip and fall. And my characters definitely do not trip and fall. It's like when I was young and single trying to figure out the dating world, I wrote My Soul to Keep. What if your husband is a 500-year-old immortal and you didn't know it? when one of my friends lost her son and didn't know if it was suicide or an accident. That grief helped lead to my novel, The Good House, which is one of my scariest novels. And my latest novel, or the one that's coming out October 31st, The Reformatory, again, a very personal story. My great uncle died at the Dozier School for Boys in Marianna, Florida in 1937. And when I figured out I had to write about this, I decided to fictionalize it, make him a little bit younger, make it happen a little bit later in the timeline, but use it as a way to not only write, which is what is probably, I think, my scariest ghost story, but also a really scary prism into what it was like to be under Jim Crow in Florida in 1950, whether you were Black or a white ally. It was like how the system shuts down growth, and how the system tries to terrorize people into compliance. And it's especially interesting now when there are concerted efforts on the part of Florida politicians, including the governor, to erase that history. So I'm actually glad The Reformatory is coming out in 2023 at the time when that conversation is at its height, because yeah, it's a ghost story, but it's also a reminder, oh no, this history was real. The ghost may not be real, but this history, which is just as scary, is real and cannot be erased.
What is a horror film that you will often recommend to people? Now, it could be Black horror, or it could be other subgenres, other horror films. What's kind of the go-to one for you?
Well, it's hard to narrow it down to one, so I don't know that I can do that. I encourage everyone to see Get Out. I've just decided that Get Out may be my favorite horror movie. Not that it's the scariest of them, but the one that has had the most impact both in my personal life and on the entire industry. It's really hard to beat Get Out, and it's such simple, sturdy filmmaking. That's hugely rewatchable. I just started rewatching another movie called The Dark and the Wicked, which, if you like Hereditary, a lot of people haven't heard of this movie. It also goes hard. It is dark and it is wicked, just like Hereditary. So if that's your itch, then this movie will scratch it. And aside from that, just like with books, there are so many good horror movies. Don't sleep on The Blackening just because you're not Black. It's actually a very funny horror comedy, which is not my favorite combination, but there are a few that do it well, which brings up Shaun of the Dead is another favorite. Shaun of the Dead, you can be watching it and forget it's a comedy, or watching it and forget it's a horror movie in, basically different points of the movie. It's like super funny when it's funny and super scary when it's scary. And I think The Blackening has a little bit of that.